Welcome to the Center for Applied Research on Targeted Violence. I'm Susan Baida, the Executive Director. Welcome to our new podcast called Understanding Targeted Violence. Our center was founded as part of the community response to the largest and deadliest anti-Semitic attack right here in Pittsburgh at a synagogue on October 27, 2018.
Multiple gunshots are heard.
The suspect keeps telling about killing Jews. He doesn't want any of them to live.
We are a partnership between the University of Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon University, both campuses of which are less than a mile away from where this tragedy occurred.
315, every available unit in the city needs to get here now. All units hold a perimeter. We're taking on AK-47 fire from out the front of the synagogue.
We are formally known as the Collaboratory Against Hate and decided to rebrand ourselves to re-articulate our vision and mission, which is to better understand and help mitigate targeted violence stemming from group hate.
7-1, clear the air. We have a surrender in progress. Suspects crawling out.
Our channels of work include applied research conducted by faculty from across a multitude of disciplines, projects in partnership with government, nonprofits, and industry, and special events like this podcast, as well as speaker series and workshops that align with both universities' missions. Today, our first guest will be Lisa Nelson, who happens to be the co-director representing University of Pittsburgh. And then she is also the associate professor of the Graduate School of Public and International Policy. Lisa, welcome.
Thank you. Very happy to be here today.
So Lisa, in 2021, after the January 6th attack on Congress, there was this pervasive belief in the country that extremism was pretty prevalent amongst military and veterans. In this research project, what did you think you would find, and what did you actually learn once the research was completed?
Sure. So I didn't really have a preformed opinion about whether or not this was true or not. I knew that there was a narrative about extremism being a prevalent factor in the veteran community and military, in law enforcement, actually. And so one of the things we started to do as a working group is to try to understand the basis for that assumption. And that led us to investigate some of the underlying empirical evidence. And so there was evidence that was out there that was representative or said to be representative of events and actions of groups and individuals that were linked to extremist ideas. And so I expected to find that it was a factor that contributed to the January 6th events, but also was an empirical reality.
It's fascinating. And there were various stages and different types of information that you gathered as part of the research. Mm-hmm. Could you tell us a little bit about that and what types of information and the formats in which you did your analysis?
Mm-hmm. We started out with a literature review because academia had a piqued interest in extremist events and extremist groups and the idea that extremism was taking hold in America. And so we started out with a literature review to try to understand what the definition was. And then also using these various definitions, we started to investigate the empirical databases that purported to give rise to the narrative that there was extremist events happening and that there were extremist groups that were growing in the United States. And then based on some of the incongruity of these databases, we also decided that we would interview veterans. So one of the things that came out of the study really is to our surprise, and my surprise, is that because extremism is a very fluid term, because it doesn't have a legal definition, because some of the research that is organized around these fluid terms and lacking in definition, empirical investigations, there really wasn't a substantive argument that extremism was on the rise as had been purported. So This also led us to be concerned about what the impact on veterans was going to be, not only veterans, but also military personnel, because if they were being accused of something that actually wasn't empirically true, then how would they feel about this, and how would they view extremism? And so we kind of were on a path of investigation that tried to understand what had been done and then add another layer with the survey of veterans.
Right. And you talk about definitions, and it's so important as researchers like yourself and faculty are culling and analyzing data. Tell us a little bit about these definitions and why is it so important, and especially in your research and what you found, why can it lead to incongruities?
Sure. So extremism is particularly a historical concept that we've dabbled in before. When I think the most notable accusation of extremism goes against Martin Luther King, who wrote from the Birmingham jail a letter that talked about his accusation as being an extremist. This, as a student of history, I understood that the idea of extremism had been used to target people in groups. And one of the reasons why it's such an effective way of targeting people is that it doesn't include action. So typically criminal activities involve you doing something or an individual doing something, groups and engaging in violent action. Extremism is just the accusation that your ideas lead to violence. And this has been something that we've tried to avoid ever since we did attack civil rights leaders. We've attacked the communists in the United States during the McCarthy era. We attacked them for their ideas and made the argument that their ideas would ultimately lead to violence. There was a turning point in our constitutional history where I think we came to terms with this being a bad idea, because if you can delegitimate groups and ideas and take them out of the political process, that's really not a democracy in action. And so we took steps constitutionally to protect First Amendment freedoms and of speech, but also association, and really in part to try to protect the civil rights movement and leaders from the kinds of things that were happening prior to Brandenburg versus Ohio, which was the pivotal case. I won't get into the details of that case. So the idea of extremism is a very effective way of labeling people as dangerous, ideas as dangerous, but it's without a check legally, because there is no violent action that they're actually taking. So this was part of what was of interest to me, and also kind of guided the research project to better understand how people were using the term.
In that context, be careful who you call an extremist.
Yes, because
Right.
the tables turn, frequently in history.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Seemed that, and just to kind of move in a different track for a moment, because I think what was really interesting about the time that you conducted this research, which was in late 2021, at the same time, RAND and I think it's the Institute for Defense Analyses,
Yes.
also conducted research. Were you aware of what was going on, and what did you learn about what was different about the way you conducted your research?
So I knew about the RAND study, and I knew that they had they did a series of surveys over the same veteran panel, actually, that we use. So AmeriSpeak has a panel of veterans, and RAND was using that same panel, and they were trying to find if there were a propensity of extremist beliefs within the veteran community. What they found ultimately is that, given setting aside some of the problematic definitions of extremism, their evaluation even of their definition of extremism in the veteran community showed that it wasn't any different than in the general population. So I knew that study was happening at the same time that we were talking about doing our survey. I didn't know about the IDA survey or investigation until recently, because it kind of came out after the fact, because there was a stand-down order that was given about extremism in the military that was the aftermath of January 6th. But I think in retrospect, they were trying to investigate whether or not it actually was a truism. And the findings, at least within the military and also with RAND, was that it wasn't as originally painted, that there wasn't extremism that was rife in the military or the veteran community.
So we're going to turn now to some of those interviews, because I remember in some of our conversations that they were really fascinating.
Yes.
I heard some great anecdotes, which I'd love to ask you to share maybe here. But yes, tell us about the interviews with both veteran and military personnel. Mm-hmm. And then also, can you share with us a little bit about their demographics, gender? I was just curious, what did the breadth of the people that you interviewed, what did they represent essentially the communities in the United States?
Yes. So because AmeriSpeak has this panel, it is a demographically diverse, geographically diverse, age diverse, and gender diverse group of people. And we wanted that because the takeaway from this idea of extremism is that it varies depending on your political belief system. So we wanted to really get a sense from veterans, like what did they think about the definition of extremism? Who in society, depending on their political belief structure, did they think represented extreme beliefs or extreme institutions? This is part of not to show that there was any true definition of extremism, but that extremism is a moving target, and you can attach extremism to institutions, to governments, to groups, and in the whole litany of the discussion revolved around who was extreme, and it included everyone, so depending on who was making the assessment. So we also talked about, given the events of January 6th, we asked a question generally of this group about political violence, because one of the things that was of interest was, if in fact your political belief system is linked to a propensity of violence, which is the assumption about extremism, then this should play out in the research. Conservatives or Republicans are extreme. That's how they were painted, as being more extreme, then they should be more prone to use violence. Well, the results of the survey were surprising in that there were a range of political viewpoints across the political spectrum that thought violence was necessary at certain points. So we chose 25 of those respondents who thought political violence was necessary across the political spectrum to query them about when they thought political violence would be necessary. And these were veteran respondents. And an interesting part of it was that the more conservative or right-leaning, we called them, respondents thought political violence might be inevitable when the government overreached. So their explanations to me when I did the interviews was, we fought for not a government, not a particular president, but we fought for a system. We fought for a constitutional system. We fought for the people. We fought for the rights of American citizens. And so when the government oversteps those constitutional restraints, which the right-leaning would see at least in the interviews, saw the government overreaching on censorship, on restrictions of freedoms, actually in the name of extremism, that's a turning point, that's a tipping point, and that the more the government acts to restrain the constitutional order, the more there's a potential or a justifiable potential for violence, political violence. Those on the right or left-leaning saw political violence necessary against groups and people who had ideas that they thought were also extreme, but were, dangerous to democracy. So and also dangerous to the government. So the idea that January 6th occurred was a danger to society, but more dangerous to the government, which they believed was the right kind of government, because it occurred during the inaugural phase of the Biden administration. So that was surprising, because it wasn't that to take the idea that extremism was associated with only right-leaning individuals was really not true. It just depended on what the object of violence was going to be. Right-leaning wanted to protect the constitutional order and saw the transgression of those rights and liberties as something that might be a tipping point for society to engage in violence against the government. And while those on the left viewed violence as a necessary aspect or response to groups that they disagreed with and or thought that were a threat to democracy or the government.
That's interesting that you found that, that the use of violence is shared across both ends of the spectrum.
Yes.
Yes. Well, I could ask you questions, I think, for another hour about your research because there's so many great and rich content and information that emerged from it. But maybe to conclude, could you give us maybe just a few of the conclusions out of the research and all the information you collected?
Sure. I think the most striking thing, as I mentioned with the political violence argument, is that political violence generally, when we looked at the data, it's increasing on both sides. It's not just a right-leaning problem or a left-leaning problem, which to me indicates that there's a brewing problem in society, whether from the right-leaning perspective that the government is overstepping its constitutional restraints, from the left-leaning that some ideas are outside of the political acceptability range. But there's a problem that I think that is emerging and is increasing. So that was striking, and also I think. For me, it reaffirms something that I had known from just the study of history, which is extremism is a very effective way to cut people out of a political process, and trying to attack it with things like censorship, restraint of political voice, or whatever it might be, is something that we've done over and over again, and it's not ever reduced the occurrence of extremism; it's fomented it. And so I think it's not a very useful term. Certainly, it's not legally definable. And politically, from our research showed that it really extremism. Who you think is extreme is more about your perspective than it is about any objective category of extremism.
Lisa, thank you so much for your time. And I think we're at the end of our podcast today, but this has been really so enlightening, and really appreciate your conducting this research for the center.
Sure.
And enlightening us within the university community. Thank
Sure.
you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.